Dead Art Studios Paint and Chat. Today we're discussing the French post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne. We're going to have a look at his work and a little bit of his life, discuss why he was so important to sort of the birth of abstract art and modern art. Now down here I've got a square of watercolour paper that I've painted in yellow, and over here I've got some tissue paper that I've cut out into a little silhouette of my favourite mountain. It's not really a mountain, it's a hill. Where I'm from there are no mountains, but there are some big hills. And that's a little silhouette of Higator that I've cut out. It's my favourite place to go walking whenever I'm up in the Peak District, and I'm going to make it into a little painting today with using the ideas of Paul Cézanne. Now, one of the major ideas he had was using and innovated in multi-point perspective. So 1 point perspective is when everything vanishes down to 1 point, one single vanishing point in a scene or a painting, and 2 point perspective or even 3 point perspective is when you have 2 or 3 vanishing points. You see that a lot in architectural drawings. If you're on the corner of a building and it heads off into the distance on both sides. But Paul Cézanne, he went next level. He went for multi-point perspective, and one of the things he would do is do like a still life, and he would stand at different angles and heights and paint some of the painting at one height and then change angle and paint it at another perspective. So you'd be looking at maybe a fruit bowl from above on the same painting. You'd have one on the side. It wouldn't be that he propped it up, it's that he's moved around and taken in all the sort of aspects that he felt was important to the painting. And that's kind of what Paul was about. He was about the painting, not necessarily the subject matter, but creating the painting itself. And in many ways, that's the beginnings of abstraction. Now, the reason I've done a mountain, though, is because he was a landscape painter. He did a lot of plein air, outdoor painting. In Provence, he was Axon. Is that my... he spent a lot of his life living there. Is that the right pronunciation? I don't know. And his favourite mountain was Mont Saint Victoria. Sounds quite very grand. And he painted it loads of times from different angles, but not all in the same painting. But he did start to introduce different sort of aspects of abstraction, and that's where the sort of Picasso and Georges Braque took some inspiration for the beginnings of Cubism as we sort of headed into total madness and abstraction throughout the sort of early to mid 20th century. So I've got 6 pieces of this tissue paper that I've got, and I've cut it out at what I would consider different perspectives for my favourite little mountain, which is Higator. And we're going to do collage. So I'm going to use these and layer them on. Now, the reason I'm going to do collage is because Picasso and Braque sort of took collage and made it their own. I mean, let's not pretend collage didn't exist before. It did. I have done a video called A Brief History of Collage. You know, a lot of ladies would do flowers, collages and things like that in Victorian eras in England, and also, as always, China and the East always had a history in all kinds of art, and they were doing collage. If anything, sticking paper to more paper, it's pretty much collage, isn't it? And they were doing that as well. But because Picasso took such great inspiration from Cézanne and called him his only master, I thought I would sort of go to the far end of where they were doing collage and bring it back into the idea of multi-point perspective with Paul Cézanne. Mix it all together, see what comes out. Also, I did watch a cool TikTok the other day of a lady doing modelling and papier-mâché with tissue paper, and it looked super cool, and I really wanted to go with that. So we're mixing it all together and seeing what we're going to get. So the first thing I need to do really is dip this in some blue. I'm going to use blue, and then the yellow should provide with a translucency. I'm hoping to see if the blue becomes translucent and mixes with the yellow and creates some new colours. Now, Paul Cézanne did use only in the sort of latter half of his career primary colours. He had a mentor. Pissarro was his mentor, and probably the only person that was really his friend throughout his life. And Pissarro convinced him to abandon his initial paintings, which were very dark and moody, and to lighten his palette, get rid of the blacks, and just stick to the primary colours. And he did, and it proved very successful for Cézanne. Now, let's get started on this, and then we can start at the beginning a little bit, and talk about Cézanne's life. I have got some primary cyan. Let's put that onto this dish. Because I'm going to dip the paint, the paper into the paint and the gloss medium and some water, I've got this little plate that I'm going to use for that. Raided the cupboard. Hopefully dishwasher friendly. I'm sure we'll find out. I'll spray some water in with my little sprayer, which is pretty handy for painting with acrylics if you want to keep things wet. And then I'm going to head into the gloss medium, pour some of that in. Quite a good healthy chunk. Now that in itself looks cool. Let's mix it up. And then we're going to soak our tissue paper into this. And then put that layer by layer. I think I've got 6. From slightly different, sort of go from top to bottom. So we get the different multi-point perspectives of my favourite mountain and the homage to Cézanne. Now, Cézanne was born in 1839 and he was hard work, Cézanne. He didn't have many friends. He was very committed to his painting. He was obsessed with painting, and he took whatever opportunity he could to basically antagonise people within the establishment and, you know, at the Paris Salon and things. And he was constantly rejected from his submissions with the other Impressionists, who also the critics weren't particularly fond of those, you know, like Manet, Monet, Renoir, things like that. But he was probably more rejected, and he used to write angry letters saying how committed he was to painting and the art of painting, and he wasn't going to kowtow to any people who might have a say on what made it to the salon and things like that. Right, let's dip this in here. I've got no idea what's going to happen. This paper could disintegrate, and that could be the end of the video. Or it could be really awesome. We just don't know. Okay. Oh. We're in. It's very, very flimsy. It's disintegrated. Oh, no. We have 6. Let's try again. Alright, let's get that on. Well, it's a disaster, but let's persevere. Let's see what happens. Now, if Cézanne had a disaster with his painting, he would get into a fit of rage and abandon the painting in like the middle of Provence. Or he would destroy it. Francis Bacon was another person that liked to destroy his artwork. I'm going to try and take a more relaxed approach. I have in the past got angry with my art, but I figure, what's the point in doing it if I'm going to get angry? You know, sometimes if you're totally into it, there can be a reason for getting angry, but I just want to avoid rage when I'm arting these days. So he moved several times back and forth from Paris under the sort of help but also hindrance of his father. His father wanted him to go into law, but Cézanne was very obsessed with painting and wanting to do with painting, and ultimately his father did kind of recognise that and gave him an allowance. I mean, these are wealthy people. He was friends with the writer Zola, and they go back and forth to Paris, or at least Cézanne was. He never quite settled in, and he'd sort of come back home again to Provence, and then he'd go back to Paris, and then he'd come back to Provence, and he had a troubled time. Zola was his friend. He was a famous writer, but in the end they fell out because Zola wrote a book about a failed artist, and Cézanne thought it was about him, and then never really spoke to him again. Now this one we've managed to keep a bit of structure to. Let's see if we can get it on there. Let's see if we can get it on. There is. Now maybe if we come with the paint on the top and soak it in, then that will create at least a vague outline of my favourite hillside. So Cézanne, he did get married and he did have a child, but he was renowned for hating physical contact or contact in general with anybody. And once his father died and he inherited quite a large sum of money in the estate of his father, he was, I mean, before he was sort of doing art in his spare time, in evening classes and things like that, much like Lowry at the beginning of his career, and the obsession for painting drove through. And ultimately his dad did let him have the allowance and let him go and be a painter, but wasn't very impressed. But ultimately his father died and left him quite a large estate and amount of money. And at that point, Cézanne was free to basically set up on his own and paint for the rest of his life. And that's basically what he did. He was called a hermit by many of his fellow Provencians and also painters. And he would just basically roam around painting non-stop. That's all he really cared about. And he was very committed to finding more than just taking an impression of what he saw, which is why it's kind of post-impressionism. And he was more into looking at trying to find something deeper within nature. So that's a lot of why he abandoned the dark colours in his work, because there's no sort of visible or obvious light sources. Everything's quite even, and he's looking at the structures of everything, the permanent things that you can find within the scene, rather than the changing light that, you know, moved around through the day and minutes as weather changed and things like that. Let's try and get another one of these on here. Now, it's starting to work a bit better now, and I think as long as I am careful, I'm going to get a vague idea of what I wanted to do, and hopefully it looks a bit like my favourite place in the Peak District, Higator. I also like Stanage Edge, but I don't know why Higator is such an interesting place to me. Right next to it is Carl's Walk, which was a Bronze Age fort. Now, what on earth they were doing living up there, I really don't know. And it did strike me that it'd be a horrendous place to live in winter. The weather would be terrible. And then I did start to wonder whether it would have been something really interesting. Like, did they have observatories? Did they go up there just to gaze at the stars and record the movements of the planets and things like that? Or were they doing a bit of farming? We don't really know, do we? That's the sort of the cool thing about history, and also in some ways a worrying thing, because your imagination runs wild, and then before you know it, the ancient aliens have turned up. And well, maybe you're into the ancient alien. I mean, I could be into them if indeed they were a logical thing to think about, which maybe they are to some people, who knows. Right, a little bit more of a spray. Let's see what we've got. So even the other Impressionists like Monet didn't particularly like the work of Cézanne. They thought it was crude. People would accuse him of just throwing the paint on the canvas, lacking gentle techniques and things like that. I mean, Monet especially is very soft, isn't he, with his work, or the ones we're familiar with. I'm quite interested to look back at the beginnings of Monet and see where his paintings come from originally, and I think we might do that one day. Now, what's starting to happen with this is I haven't really got the shape. I have got the shape of Higator up here, but down here I'm getting some very interesting striations and lines from the tissue paper as we apply it. So that's kind of interesting, and we'll go with that. Let's put the other bit over here. And gloss it in, push it in with the brush into the gloss. and just start making layers. So yes, Cézanne, he was obsessed with the structure of the paintings and not really the subject matters, which is quite similar to me actually in some ways. When he put people in his paintings, he often used men because they were cheap models, and he didn't really like people insinuating that there was sensuality or eroticism in his work. So he often used just like working men and things like that. And when he did mix men and women, he would keep them separate. And he did use people like in the Bathers painting, I think it's called. But he was more interested in using the trees and the landscape and the way the people were shaped. He didn't use real models, he used sketches and stuff he'd done over the years. And he was interested in trying to create a structure of a painting. And this is really where abstraction started to come from, the realization that you would take abstracts, pieces of the real world and real people, start breaking it up, trying to represent something maybe a little bit deeper within the scene that you were looking at, or within your mind and self, ultimately, when we start to think about abstract expressionism and things like that. Now, if we look here, I've kind of gone into the yellow. So I think I've got no choice but to go a little bit more. And I might just use more blue and go blue all over. So this is very experimental today, but that's kind of in the spirit of Cézanne. He wasn't interested in doing the same old thing. He was interested in pushing forwards. And that's quite a familiar thing with artists. If we think of Rothko with his colour field paintings, he was similar in many ways to Cézanne. He didn't get on with a lot of people. He had very high and strict ideas of what things should be and how things should be done. And he was obsessed with his paintings and ideas around it. And also Lowry as well, very obsessed with certain ideas and things in painting, and very obsessed with going out and just being committed to being an artist and a painter. And we saw that in Cézanne as well. Interesting to see. Now, it's worth noting that abstraction is kind of just given to Picasso, isn't it? And Braque with Cubism, but there were other people around playing with it. I mean, we need to think about Barbara Hepworth, who was very central to abstraction, and she was also interested in using nature and bringing abstract form from nature. Her surroundings in Devon, in St Ives in Cornwall, and also sort of monoliths and standing stones and things like that. It's very tempting with art to have just the narrative, isn't it? Impressionism, post-impressionism, so Manet, Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, breaking away a little bit from all of that, rejecting it, moving on to Picasso, who picks up on it, takes it, uses it, and sort of makes it his own with Braque, and then on beyond that. But there's people all around them doing things, coming up, innovating, not necessarily getting taken up by the critics or noticed by the critics and put into the world of art history. So, although Cézanne is seen as sort of the father of modern art, I mean, modern art, I think already is there, isn't it? I would say more abstract art. There would have been people all around. And it's interesting that despite him being unsuccessful, he was well known. He was in high society. You know, the famous artists and writers at the time, they supported him and gave him money, and he was very lucky in that sense. I think if he'd been like the son of a blacksmith or something like that, it might have been a very different tale for him. So he was still within the narrative of art and high society at the time, and he was known. I've got this piece of pulpy tissue that we started off with in the first instance. I'm going to put that on the front into the foreground, create some texture that way. And cover this bit on the left hand side, which is a bit empty. So here we are, this is a bit of collage, a bit of painting, a bit of, I don't even know really what it is at the moment. And we are just on the search, aren't we really, for whatever's next in our creative journey, or in your creative journey. Okay, let's get a bit more tissue and add. So these are just the cheapest napkins I could find, and I chose the cheapest ones I could find because they'd be the thinnest and they didn't have any sort of edge patterning on or anything like that. So they're sort of homogeneous. Let's get that down here on the front, give it a spray. Let's get some more gloss medium to get it pinned down. Let's start building this thing up. We have got a horizon of Higator from 2 different points as well, sort of fading, so that kind of has worked. I was worried at the start. So we are making some progress, and I am going to push through with this one. I'm not gonna go and destroy it right now. I mean, I have destroyed a fair few of my paintings with table saws, trying to make them interesting and look for new ways of creating, I guess. And then also I've just thrown some in the bin in my time. Let's put a bit more blue on and then take that on directly onto the piece. The thing is, on the top, the blue and the yellow have not mixed very nicely, so I might come in and do something different there to recreate a sky. Been working on the painting for a while now, and I've run out of memory on my camera up above, so I'm going to have to show you what I've got by gently lifting it. I've been putting lots of layers, sort of gloss medium and water on. If I can tear the paper from the sides, then we'll get a vague idea of what it's going to look like when it's dry. But I've definitely been heading into a new technique here, something new for me at least, and I enjoyed it. The tactileness of the fingers and the blending is very nice, and I think with some practice it could make some good effects. Now, Paul Cézanne, he died in 1906, and he got pneumonia after he was out painting in a storm, or a storm came, and he was already quite ill by that point and had diabetes. And so he was in his 60s, so he'd had a long painter's life, and he left a very long legacy of hundreds and hundreds of paintings, and also ignited maybe the beginnings of abstraction and definitely cubism. Right, what do you think? I'm going to let it dry and I'm going to do some more on it. I think it's an interesting start to something that I might use in the future on other work. Dead Art Studios. See you next time.